Today, I want to tackle a question that affects every single reptile keeper. From the kid who just got their first leopard gecko to the person that's been breeding Burmese pythons since the 80s. And that is, what material should you build your enclosures out of? And quite honestly, this question has a million different potentially correct answers. So let's get into it. My name is Cole. This is Magnus. Welcome back to Boas and Buffoonery. Now, there are hundreds upon hundreds of options for what sort of enclosure you could set up for your reptile friends. Some people are using grow tents. Some people even have full greenhouses built in their backyard that I'm not at all super jealous of. And some people are still using tubs and racks. So I couldn't possibly break down every single enclosure type and style and put it into one video. So instead, I'm going to narrow my focus to what I see as the three most popular and most common types of reptile enclosures. Those being, of course, PVC enclosures, which I'm going to include other animal safe plastics in this category, wooden enclosures, which is going to mean both sealed plywood as well as the classic melamine enclosures. And then, of course, probably the most common style of enclosure in the hobby, and that is glass tanks. And spoiler alert, none of these enclosure styles or enclosure materials are absolutely perfect and without drawback. So I'm not going to try to convince you what the absolute best enclosure material is. What I'm going to do is give you some pros and cons of each of the available options so that you can make a decision based on your specific animal, your specific needs, and your specific budget. So let's break them down one by one, starting with what I see as the most common enclosure that most people keep their reptiles in, at least their first couple of reptiles: glass enclosures. If you've been in the hobby for a while, odds are the first enclosure you ever set up looked pretty similar to the first reptile enclosure I ever set up. When I first got Astrid, the hognose snake, as a baby, we set her up in a 40-gallon long tank filled with aspen shavings, had a couple hides in it, had a water bowl. You've seen this enclosure 1,000 times. We had a heat bulb, and we even had one of those silly like moonlight bulbs that we would turn on at night. We've evolved our care a lot since then. And that enclosure was relatively thoughtfully set up. It was just very simple, pretty basic. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that, but we've improved since then. Now, there is good reason why the first enclosure most people set up for their animals is made out of glass. That is because glass enclosures are everywhere. They're readily available, reasonably accessible, and absolutely affordable for most keepers. You can also find one in the shape and style that suits your specific animal, as long as it is a relatively small animal, as most glass enclosures really are only suitable for small or micro-sized reptiles. But the other big advantage to glass enclosures is visibility. Most of us, when we get our first reptile, we want to see them all the time, and glass enclosures allow us to do that. Because you can see all around the enclosure, it's really easy to set up beautiful displays in a glass enclosure that allow you to watch your animal through every part of the day. However, this excellent visibility actually leads me to my first major issue with glass enclosures. Their first major drawback is that visibility. If you have something like a Euromastix that wants to be out and basking in the daytime anyway, it's really not a huge concern. But if you have a bit of a shy snake or a nocturnal animal, that glass enclosure, enabling them to see out of all angles of their enclosure, can absolutely increase the stress for that animal, which we want to avoid as much as we can. And the second major issue that I have with glass enclosures is they do a lousy job of holding heat and humidity, at least in a predictable way. And sometimes they can even get way too hot. If you have a glass enclosure by the window, for example, on a particularly sunny day, that glass enclosure can very quickly turn into a sauna and dries out super fast, especially if you're using like a mesh lid with a heat lamp on top. That enclosure can become remarkably dry. So if you're trying to set up a tropical species in a glass enclosure, it requires a very high level of effort to maintain that humidity. I also mentioned that part of the draw towards glass enclosures is that they're readily available and that they're super affordable. And that's true largely thanks to the fact that you can get many of them secondhand. But most of the secondhand glass enclosures that you can find on Facebook Marketplace, Kijiji, or Craigslist if you're in the United States are converted fish tanks that only have a top opening lid. And if you are someone who likes to interact with your reptiles like myself, a top opening lid is usually not the best option. Primarily because if you want to handle your reptile and you go to scoop them out, if you're coming at them from above, if you're coming down on your animal, that really comes across to your lizard or to your snake or whatever pet you have as this is a predator and I need to run. It just starts you off in your handling session on the back foot, in a bad place where you don't really want to be. All that being said, glass enclosures can absolutely be an excellent option, especially if you find front opening glass enclosures for small arid dwelling species, whether snakes or lizards. That's probably the perfect animal to put in a glass enclosure. But if you are someone who likes to set up bioactive enclosures, many glass enclosures are now being specifically designed to support those bioactive environments, which can be fantastic. And I also really like vertically oriented glass enclosures for things like crested geckos, gargoyle geckos, these arboreal small lizards where you still need to increase the humidity in the enclosure, but because these are small animals, it's going to be a small enclosure, and you may want to lean towards those bioactive setups anyway. The drawback won't hit you quite as hard. But most of the things we just talked about, you can also set up in a PVC or a wooden enclosure. I wouldn't necessarily recommend a bioactive setup in a wooden enclosure, but we'll get into that in a little bit. But where glass enclosures to me really shine is those beautiful display setups, the centerpiece of your living room. If you have a confident animal that doesn't mind being out and being visible, and you can thoughtfully set up their enclosure to where it is visually, aesthetically pleasing, but also secure and safe for your animal. You're so cute. If you've been in the hobby for a little while now, most of your enclosures, I would hazard a guess, are made out of PVC or some other sort of animal-safe plastic. PVC enclosures have sort of become the gold standard in the reptile hobby, and absolutely for good reason. They are the absolute best style of enclosure for maintaining proper heat and humidity, which makes them an excellent choice for most tropical species. But they can also be set up just fine for arid species like bearded dragons or Uromastyx. Another huge draw for PVC enclosures is that they are incredibly lightweight, which makes them easy to move, easy to adapt, and easy to customize. If you are someone who still moves around a lot, a PVC enclosure won't have you hiring a moving team every time you need to transport your enclosures. And many of the brands out there making PVC enclosures make expansion kits for those enclosures, which makes it really awesome if you are someone who is buying an animal as a baby, that you can actually keep them in the same enclosure throughout their entire lifespan and just build out the enclosure, make the enclosure bigger as you go. And PVC enclosures are also super available. There are tons of reptile specific brands making PVC enclosures designed for our lovely scaly friends. So they seem kind of perfect. What are the drawbacks to PVC enclosures? I said that all of these enclosure options have drawbacks. What are the downsides to working with plastic or PVC enclosures? First and foremost is the inconsistent quality of PVC enclosures. I have had some PVC enclosures that are rock solid, made of super thick plastic, and will stand the test of time. I will probably have those enclosures forever. However, I have also had PVC enclosures that were incredibly fragile and breakable using thin, kind of lesser quality plastic, and I've had those enclosures break. I've had the doors on these enclosures be kind of flimsy and crappy. The inconsistency of the quality of the build of the PVC enclosures from brands that produce them is more dramatic than it is with glass enclosures. Most glass enclosures are about as good as every other glass enclosure, whereas PVC enclosures have a wide range of quality. And the second major issue with PVC enclosures is the cost. PVC reptile enclosures are remarkably expensive. For the same enclosure built out of glass, you are likely to pay double to triple the price tag if you want that enclosure to instead be made out of PVC. Honestly, I think that's the biggest reason why you may want to build an enclosure out of anything other than PVC plastic. Some keepers also have concerns about the environmental impact of using plastic for your reptile enclosures, which I absolutely understand. Though if these enclosures are to stand the test of time, as most of them do, I don't see that being as much of a concern as it's sometimes made out to be. If you are someone who's looking to save a little bit of money and you happen to be particularly handy, wooden enclosures might be the perfect option for you. Wooden enclosures can be built for much less money than an equivalently sized PVC enclosure. But the other thing that wooden enclosures really allow you to do is customize the exact dimensions and the exact size of your enclosure. And especially if you are someone who keeps large to giant animals, then there may not be commercially available PVC or glass setups for your pet reptile. If you're someone who keeps Burmese pythons, or you're someone who keeps monitor lizards, the larger monitor lizards, I'm not really talking about Ackies here, like the Asian water monitors or your savanna monitors, the biggest enclosure that you're going to find readily available in glass or PVC is going to be an 8x4x4. And realistically, that's not big enough for those giant lizards or your berms or your retics, so you may need to build your own wooden enclosure. And wooden enclosures can be fantastic. They do a really good job at holding and maintaining heat and temperature, which I love, though they do a rather lousy job of holding humidity. Not so much like glass where it just seeps out of the enclosure, but more because if you have a wooden enclosure that stays humid for a long time, it is going to warp and it is likely eventually going to mold. No matter how well you take care of it, no matter how well you maintain it, and you will need to do regular maintenance on your wooden enclosures, they will warp and eventually they will mold, which means eventually they'll need to be replaced, whether that's panel by panel or whether that's the entire enclosure. In my eyes, that is by far the biggest drawback to wooden enclosures, is the amount of effort it takes to build them, the amount of effort it takes to maintain them, and the fact that eventually, no matter how well you do all of those things, you will still likely need to replace that enclosure. But if you're someone who likes an ongoing project, if you're someone who is a little strapped for cash, wooden enclosures can be a fantastic way to keep, especially large arid species would be perfect for a wooden enclosure, as well as animals that you maybe have a really specific shape or style to the enclosure that you want customized to your specifications. So the work and humidity thing is one of the major drawbacks to wooden enclosures, but the other major drawback to an enclosure built out of wood, whether that is melamine or whether that is sealed plywood, is these enclosures are stupid heavy. They are ridiculously heavy compared to both glass and PVC enclosures. I talked about how much I love how lightweight PVC enclosures are. Wooden enclosures are the absolute opposite of that. Especially if, like me, one of the reasons you have a wooden enclosure is because you have one of those very large animals. My boa constrictor, Urza, is in an 8x4x4 wooden enclosure, and that thing is on wheels, and we still can't really move it. And I had to move houses with that enclosure in my possession. I had to actually ask the guy who helped me build it to come over to my house, help take it apart, and bring it in his truck to my new house. It is a hassle. It is a ton of extra work. And of course, I paid him for his gas and his time, which added an extra level of expense. And all this to say, I will still need to eventually replace that enclosure, because it isn't molding, but it is already starting to warp along the bottom, because again, that's a humid dwelling species. If I could go back and do it again, as much as I am thankful to the person who helped me build that enclosure, and as much as I love that enclosure, I would probably have just splurged for the PVC instead. The flip side to that personal experience is I keep Magnus, my Uromastyx, in a wooden enclosure, and it is fantastic. The fact that it's built out of wood enabled me to drill shelves, which act like little climbing platforms for my Uromastyx, and Uromastyx like an arid or dry environment anyway, so that wood isn't going to warp, at least not for a very long time. It's kind of the perfect setup for a Uromastyx, which is a relatively large, very active lizard that needs a big enclosure but doesn't need a high level of humidity. Are you gonna poop on me? So what is the best material to build a reptile enclosure out of? What is the best home for your scaly friend? Well, it largely depends on your specific animal, your specific space needs, and your budget. I would say, on average, if money is no object, if you're not worried about sticking to a budget, then PVC enclosures are the best option on the market for most reptiles. I think they give you the most control over the heat and humidity of your reptile's environment, which gives them the best possible opportunity to thrive in your care. But that being said, money usually is an object to most people, especially because as reptile keepers, we spend a lot of money on our animals. So if you are a little more budget conscious and you are a handy individual who is comfortable with maintenance, who is ready to work on an enclosure over the long term, then I think wooden enclosures can be an excellent option for you. And if you keep small animals and you're interested in bioactive setups, or you keep small arid or small arboreal lizards, especially if you keep diurnal species that won't get too stressed out from a bunch of visual stimulation going on around them at all times, then I think glass enclosures can be a phenomenal option for you, especially if you want a very visual centerpiece to a room. At the end of the day, this is just my 2 cents. I don't have all the answers, and I absolutely want to hear what you think about these different enclosure options. And if you have experience with things like greenhouses, grow tents, that sort of thing, or even if you want to tell me that actually racks are the best of the bunch, then feel free to leave a comment below. We may agree, we may disagree, but I want to hear what you have to say. With all that out of the way, my friends, have a wonderful rest of your day, an awesome rest of your week, and I'll see you guys next time. Cheers. Oh, shoot. Also, subscribe. I'm supposed to ask you to subscribe. Please subscribe. Magnus, tell them to subscribe. You guys should really subscribe. He doesn't have a weird voice. He's a grown-ass man. He's 10 years old. Of course, the neighbor decides to get the leaf blower out right outside my window the second I start recording. Thanks so much for that, Paul. I don't know if his name's Paul. I don't talk to people.